Welcome, everyone. My name is Lucy Gray. I am the co-founder of Global Actionable Innovations Global. And along with the Charter for Compassion, we are happy to welcome you to Thrive. We are honored to open Thrive with Dr. Howard Gardner and Andrew Gardner. Howard is the John H. and Elizabeth A. Hobbs Research Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's widely known for his groundbreaking work in multiple intelligences and the good work framework. And joining him is his son and my good friend, Andrew Gardner, an attention specialist and leadership coach who helps individuals and organizations develop strategic focus and purposeful leadership. Together, they will reflect on how education, attention, ethical leadership must evolve in an era shaped by rising authoritarianism, artificial intelligence, and the powerful forces of the attention economy, and what that means for the future of democracy. So, without further ado, I want to welcome Howard, Andrew, and thank them for coming. I'm going to turn the conversation over to you, and we look forward to your comments.
Bringing everyone together for this incredibly important conversation, not just today, but all the different sessions that are happening in Thrive this year. And just kudos to you for putting energy behind this. And thanks to Felipe, too, who's behind the scenes helping out. So excited to have a conversation with Dad. Dad and I talk every week, usually on Sunday mornings, and the conversation ranges from my kid to life in Cambridge to often political and world events. And in preparation for today, we had a nice conversation last week. I think we're going to dive in. I think a little bit of a framework for the conversation today. So Dad is known mostly for, has done a lot of really important work around the concept of good work. So we're going to talk a little bit about what good work is. What are some ways to help teach and educate for good workers in the country and in the world? And then some of the challenges to teaching for good work in an era of elected authoritarianism. What we were remarking even before we went live today is even since Dad and I spoke on Friday, the US has gone to war. Block has laid off 4,000 employees because AI is changing the way they work, or so they speak, though there was a New York Times article this morning saying one of their former employees that actually may just be BAU. There's war, there's AI layoffs, there's Anthropic making the choice on Friday to not partner with the Department of Defense, or Department of War, as we call it now. There's so much happening so quickly. How do we metabolize, process this? And how do we teach in a world where the speed is relentless and the impact of the choices are so profound and deep? So that's a little bit of the frame for the conversation today. And Dad, I think it might be nice for you to make any kind of opening remarks, and then we can dive into talking about good work and going from there.
Very good. Well, thanks, Andrew. And also thanks to Lucy. I'm speaking in my home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, near Boston. It was nice and quiet until construction started outside my window. And even though I shut the door, I have to apologize in advance if you hear the machines working, but no control over that if you're not in a studio. I think it's relevant that my parents and also my wife's father were Jewish people living in Europe, and they were lucky enough to be close. They understood what the Nazis were all about. And in my parents' case, they literally arrived here in the United States on November 9th, 1938, which is the famous Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, where hundreds and perhaps thousands of people were killed and maimed because they were Jewish by the Nazis. I was born during the middle of the Second World War, and in many ways, I was very lucky because I lived in a country where democratic processes not only had been established, but they were pretty much taken for granted. For those of you who the history of the last 80 years in the United States, we had the McCarthy era in the early 1950s, and we had the Nixon-Watergate scandal in the early 1970s, but the democratic institutions, the Congress and the courts, were strong enough that neither of those things came close to toppling democracy. But Lucy would not have taken the initiative for this gathering if she didn't realize that democratic values and institutions are fragile now. And if they only were fragile in the United States, it wouldn't be so bad. There is the rest of the world, but I have a hard time thinking of any country of any size where non-democratic, totalitarian, authoritarian, even fascistic kinds of pressures are very palpable. And we all know that in a world of social media and of AI, any notion that change is going to be gradual, change can take place very, very quickly. And if we do value democracy, however we define it, however we operationalize it, we can't sit back and hope that things will be okay. We have to think about the kinds of things we can do, the kinds of things we can say, the kinds of positions we can take, and the kinds of risks that we can take if we try to preserve the good political institutions. And the last thing I'll say in introduction to myself, I'm hardly a person who is brave. I haven't done things which have put me at great risk. Bravery has been simply developing ideas and scholarship which might be controversial. But I have to ask myself, as so many of you are asking yourself, if we don't say or do anything now, are we going to be like so many people in Europe in the 1930s, realizing that it's too late to say and do anything?
We've had conversations think about what were OPA thinking, the tipping points that made them recognize they needed to get out, and staying until 38 was pretty late. And the fact that they were able to escape was profoundly lucky. And so those are questions that we're grappling with in similar ways now.
I think everybody who is listening and everybody who has children is wondering what passport they have and how valid it will be if they feel that they are under siege. And I don't think anybody should assume that they're perfectly safe because they come from the right demography or live in the right place. And we just have to look and see what happened in Minneapolis a month or two ago to see that it's not enough to be an American citizen in good standing. If people want to label you as dangerous, a lot to fall back on.
So I want to begin grounding us a little bit in your theories and some of the work. And I think about the history of kind of progressive education and progressivism, and of course, Dewey writing Democracy in Education, and a lot of the work coming around building an active citizenship. I think your work in many ways is extensions of that. And when it came to that was ways of expressing understanding and a different measurement of what it meant to be intelligent. I think it would be interesting to hear from you. MI came out, it made an impact. About 25 years later, you put out the idea of good work because there were some misinterpretations and some challenges with the ways that it was being interpreted. And so you came up with a different theory about what it meant to be an active citizen and an engaged citizen and doing this good work. So I'd love to hear a little bit about the origins of what brought you to building the theory of good work, and then a little bit about good work so that people who are not familiar with it here can have a grounding for where we're going.
Sure. Well, those of you who are lucky enough never to have heard of multiple intelligences theory, let me give you the 1-minute version. For most of the 20th century, we believed as citizens and as scholars that intelligence was a single thing, probably something that you were born with, couldn't do much about. There was a test called the IQ test, which would say how smart you are. And it was a reasonable predictor of how you would do in certain kinds of schools in the 20th century. But we have to say if the IQ test had been developed in the 18th or 19th century, it wouldn't have been the same kind of test. Tests always reflect the values of a society at a given moment in time. But thanks to some lavish research support, 45 years ago, I developed a theory called multiple intelligences, which basically claims that our notion of IQ samples two forms of intelligence, linguistic and logical mathematical. And sure, if you do well in those, you probably do well in 20th century schools, but I think there are at least a half a dozen other intelligences, and the names there are musical, spatial, bodily kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalist. And if you're lucky enough never to have heard of these, any search engine can list these intelligences and give you a quick operationalization of them. But here's the important point. Intelligences are value neutral. You can use linguistic intelligence to foster hatred or to write wonderful poetry. You can use interpersonal intelligence to try to help people, as Andrew does in his own work. You can use interpersonal intelligence to manipulate people. And I don't have to mention political figures now, but you can all fill in the blanks of political figures who are trying to use their understanding of other people to put them in very destructive ways. So about 30 years ago, working with two scholars who were very similar to me in their interests, Mike Csikszentmihalyi, many of you will see his name but not know how to pronounce it, and Bill Damon, who's much easier to recognize and pronounce. We said that any human skill is basically value neutral. What does it take to be a good worker? And by extension, what does it take to be a good citizen? Now we could have, but instead we spent 10 years doing research in a whole range of professions, a whole range of vocations. And we concluded, and this was not just the three of us, it was probably 50 different researchers working all over the country, not particularly abroad, that good work and good citizenship have three components, and they all begin with the letter E in English. Good work is, so let's take probably most of you are teachers of one sort or another. Teacher needs to be excellent. Teacher needs to know his or her stuff. Teacher needs to be engaged. They need to care. They need to want to go to work, or at least are happy to go to work when it's required. They don't say, thank God it's Friday. Oh my God, it's Sunday night. So they're engaged. They like their work. But, and here's what Andrew already introduced, they try to behave in an ethical way. Every profession that we know, I'm talking particularly here about the West, but it could be universal, whether it's medicine or psychiatry or law or journalism, people who practice those professions run into ethical dilemmas, places where it's not clear what the right thing to do. It's often clear what the expedient thing to do is, but what should you do when you're really faced with difficult issues, difficult problems? And that's the third E of good work and good citizenship, not just excellence, not just engagement, but also being willing to face difficult ethical issues and to try to resolve them as best you could. And we have another mnemonic, I hope I can remember it, but Andrew will help me otherwise, that ethical issues are usually dilemmas. Dilemmas in every profession. I mean, let's say you're a journalist and you're covering a story and you discover you have a personal stake in that story. What should you do? Should you stop covering it? Should you hide your prejudice? Should you announce it, but then basically lose your credibility? That's an ethical issue that every journalist does. You're a lawyer, you have a good case, but then it turns out that your client's lying to you. What do you do? That's an ethical issue. You're a doctor, there's only enough medicine to treat 3 people. One of them is a friend of yours, one of them is an enemy of yours, what you don't know. What's the ethical thing to do? And so these are dilemmas. And we say, in a dilemma, you have to be able to state the dilemma, discuss what it is, debate the different sides, make a decision. Your dilemmas can't just remain in the textbook. You have to make a decision. And then very important afterward, debrief and say, did I do the right thing? Should I have done it differently? If I had to do it again, would I do it differently? So again, let's use teaching as an example. You've got 2 problem kids in a class of 30. How much time should you spend with these kids trying to help them? Let's say one has a cognitive problem, one has an emotional problem, but you've got 28 other kids in the class. That's an ethical dilemma. You can't look it up, but you can discuss, debate, decide, debrief, and so on. I always assumed that professionals would be able to have these discussions, these debates, again, the letter D. But then when I began to talk to Andrew and began to reflect on what's happening in so many societies now, it presupposes a democratic society. What that means, presupposes you can state what you think, you can be honest about it, you can put forth your own point of view, you can debate it, you can make a decision, you can reflect on it, and you don't have to worry if someone is going to post on social media something that you said that was unfortunate or something that you said which wasn't true, but especially you corrected it afterwards, you kind of assumed that you had a right to speak freely and not to get held accountable unless you violated something like the First Amendment or the norms of a particular entity. One thing which occurred to me when I was preparing for this talk with Andrew, I wonder how many of you, and since you can't raise the hand, you have to just answer yourself, know about Chatham House rules. Chatham House rules was something that was established in Britain, probably generations ago. And Chatham House rules basically say people should say what they think, and they should be assured that nobody will go out of that meeting and say, well, Andrew said this, or Vanessa said that, or Oscar said that, or Agnes said that, or August said that, that your anonymity is protected. And I go to meetings now at Harvard, and as you know, Harvard is very much under the 8 ball with the current national administration. The meetings often have Chatham House rules, namely, you cannot say, oh, Howard said this, or Ellen said that, or Vanessa said that to other people, and you agree to do that. And that's a way of preserving a shard of democracy in a less democratic entity. But who's going to prevent somebody from secretly video or taping that conversation and then putting it in social media? And I've just learned in the last half hour, if you put something on LinkedIn, there are over 1 billion people who can see it almost instantaneously. So a lot of assumptions, both about multiple intelligences and about good work and good citizenship, are really under scrutiny now and attack because of the anti-democratic forces, the anti-Chatham House forces, which no matter where you stand on them now, you certainly are aware that they exist. So, Andrew, I hope that wasn't just a monologue, that it clarified some of the things that you want to probe further in.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as you described the challenges to some of the steps in good work and the 6 Ds, which are actually now shared on the screen: define, discuss, debate, deliberate, decide, and debrief. I took the liberty of popping those into Gemini Nano Banana 3 and creating a little comic to show what that looks like. I don't know if you can see. I'm a little curious around what we can do and where the safe spaces are for educators to engage students in this kind of work. Because you're saying it's a lot harder. You've got Chatham rules now at Harvard to try to keep stuff off the record. And of course, we're living in a surveillance state. So there has to be some shared agreements around things. But what can educators do what can humans do to continue having this ethical dimension within an environment where culturally it's challenged directly?
Well, I'll give a very personal answer, Andrew. I have a couple of research teams that I work with, and they each have a half a dozen people, and they're all people who trust, and they trust me. And so we can have the kind of discussions that you're talking about. But recently we hired some new people, and one of my staff said, well, let's invite the new people in. And I said, I'm not ready for that yet. We have to have a sense of who they are, how responsible they are, how trustworthy they are. And then we have to have, I wouldn't say a formal initiation, but I have to say, we'll call them John and June. And we have to say, we want to invite you to our private meetings each week. And we're very frank there, including discussing things that are quite sensitive. We'd like to invite you to this, and we're not going to make you sign an oath. But we have to ask you whether you're willing to accept these rules, and if you slip up, to try to correct them. And if you're not comfortable, you can continue working with us, but we don't feel that it would be right for you to participate in these meetings. So it's not an official initiation, but for better or worse, I've worked with literally hundreds of students and hundreds of researchers over the last 60 years. It really is 60 years. And there are bad apples. And I'm extremely lucky that they've been very few and far between, but they can make enormous damage. And so I think it's not a fraternity, it's not an official initiation, but it is a kind of a judgment that you make, and you don't make it alone, you make it with your peers, and you expect your peers to also look out, because there's a big difference if somebody screws up as a mistake, than if they screw up because they didn't have good values or because they didn't care. And I won't go into any of the details, but in my experience as a professor, we've had students who did things that they shouldn't have done. I mean, the current example now would be having AI write a paper. Fortunately, I stopped being a professor before AI could do that. On a faculty, and many of you will know what a faculty is like, there are people who say, oh, let's give everybody more chances. And the people who say, no, this person violated the fundamental principle of academics, which is you do your own work. And if you quote something, you give credit. Some of you may know that Harvard lost a president because she didn't annotate when she took material from other sources. So I guess the short answer is you have to reinvent your profession for a time when the spreading of information and the sharing of values can't be taken for granted anymore. And this is actually true. In the last week, I can't remember the details, but two people in very different circumstances came to me and said, what should I do in the following circumstance? And I guess they came to me because I'm old and I'm at least wise. And I recommended a very important book. It's a book by a man named Albert Hirschman. And I read the book 50 years ago, and I actually had a little correspondence with him, but I just discovered something amazing about him. So Albert Hirschman wrote a book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And if you remember nothing else from this conversation, get Albert Hirschman's book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, or if you're lazy, go to ChatGPT and ask for a summary. And what Hirschman claims in this book is that when you're in an organization which is doing something that you don't like or approve of, you owe a certain amount of loyalty to the organization. If somebody trusted you, you kind of need to trust the organization to a certain point. But if you don't like what the organization is doing, then you move to voice, which means you speak up and say, Howard, you mean well, but I think the way you treated somebody or the way that you thought about this issue just isn't right. It doesn't even stand by your own values. And if Howard is a sympathetic listener, he will try to at least respond to that and maybe correct what he's been doing. So that's loyalty and voice. But if it's clear that Howard is deaf and he's not going to pay any attention to you, then you have to exit. And exit means you don't have to write an editorial and put it in the New York Times, but you have to say, I'm just not comfortable with what this organization is doing or the way it's doing it. And so I wish you luck, but I'm leaving. So that's the message of exit, voice, loyalty. What I hadn't realized until a week ago, and Andrew doesn't know this, is I was reading a book called Marseille, 1940. Marseille in southern France was where many Jews from Germany and other countries which had been invaded by the Nazis went in the hopes of getting a boat to Portugal or Spain, or if they were lucky, to Cuba or to Latin America or to the United States, or indeed maybe to Asia, I don't know. It turns out that Albert Hirschman, who was himself a German or Austrian Jew, was in Marseille, and he literally helped hundreds of people get out of France. And I didn't know about this, even though I certainly knew who he was. What a hero. A man who not only did the right thing under enormous pressures, but then wrote a book which is decades after he's dead, is still something I can recommend to people. Those are things that people can think about when they're dealing with different circumstances. And reading Hirschman, and if you have the energy, reading Marseille, 1940, better things than reading the funnies or the latest video that's been put on TikTok.
So there's a lot to unpack there. You were describing kind of the circle of trust and entry into sensitive conversations at work. I immediately got to that tension point of how are we excluding people if we're not letting them in? And how are we not accepting multiple voices and multiple perspectives if there's a layer of opacity around how an organization works, be it academic group like Project Zero or a corporation or a school. And so there's a tension there. And I think that tension is often tinkered with and played with. I mean, we look at an organization like Turning Point and saying, oh, everyone's voices are allowed here. And yet some voices are elevated and others are not. And that has led to some political violence. And then just today, we're reading Michael Roth in the New York Times from Wesleyan University, my alma mater, where he's doing the Summer of Democracy to try to get everyone to come together to support democracy, and all these college students to kind of replicate what happened in 1964 after MLK rallied. And so I'm thinking about this concept of organizations and bringing in multiple voices, level of protection that's needed, and what's your insight into that nuance of how do we make a democratic multi-voice context? And it's not an easy question, but I'm curious what comes up for you when you think about that.
Yeah. Well, certainly no person alone should think that he or they is omniscient enough to make the decisions on their own. And then recently, when we heard somebody whom you all know say, at the end, I make all the decisions, that's exactly not the way you should do things. You should have people whom you know and trust, and assume you don't always have the right answer yourself, but mold things. And as I said, you have to make a decision sometimes, but you need to spend time debriefing it and say, if we could do it again, we do the same way, and why not? So I guess one answer is it's not static, it's evolving. And many times, you mentioned Project Zero, my research group, we should never say, well, we've got it all figured out. But we might say that here in the third month of 2026, this is the best we can do, and we should try to do it for the time being, but we should revisit it. And as everybody who's listening knows, when a new leader, whether they're a boss or a very generous person, comes in, then the stuff is necessarily recalibrated. Even when they say we're keeping all the same values, the person brings in his or her own values. They're not made by a machine. And so I guess the short, if not very helpful answer is, this is a continuing conversation. We should never say we have it all figured out. And as I mentioned, I've spent a lot of time with my colleagues thinking about what professions are. And for me, growing up well over a half century ago, the professions I knew were law, medicine, journalism, and it's not even clear that those are going to be the professions of the future. I was just in a webinar right before this. That's why I showed up a bit late, where I learned, and it's no secret, that it's people with AI expertise who are now what corporations most want. We all have a sense of what AI expertise is, but I don't think anybody has figured out what are the professional norms of AI. And Andrew alluded to, these are two AI organizations which don't have the same values of what they'll do with the national government. So not only does it have to be a continuing conversation within established professions, because I don't think law and medicine and journalism are going to disappear, but they're going to be radically reinvented. I have a wonderful student. I think I won't say his name because that might put pressure on him, but he's studying how young people today, students, think about journalism. And when we talk to young people about journalism, we don't even use the word news, because while news heading to me, and probably most people who are watching or listening, it may not have a meaning to young people. We say, how do you find out what's going on? And we use that as a way of getting to the different sites that they visit, and do they ever listen to or observe opinions that are different from theirs? And what do they think it means to have researched something as opposed to just spreading it around? When I knew about journalism 60 years ago, totally different profession than nowadays. And when we hear that Warner and Paramount are discussing about who owns CNN going into the future, CNN could change its journalism just like the Washington Post changed its journalism just because there's a new owner. And the New York Times, which most people who I know respect, has at least stayed in the same family for 150 years, whereas the Washington Post, once the Bradley family gave up ownership, it became a ping pong. So there's no institution which is immune from these forces. But what's wonderful about what Lucy and Andrew are doing is saying we can't throw democracy away, but we can't assume that what the Greeks meant 2,500 years ago or Declaration of Independence said 250 years ago, or indeed Franklin Roosevelt's four freedoms from the 1940s, is the same thing that democracy means today, when so many people use the word but are doing things that I would consider to be anti-democratic.
This makes me think a little bit around what you're talking about, like the principles of journalism, the principles of democracy, and the importance, we talked about this a little bit the other day, of understanding disciplines and doing interdisciplinary work. And in your book, The Disciplined Mind, from the early 90s, it was not disciplined in terms of discipline, but discipline in terms of the disciplines that we learn the world through and that we understand the world through. So history is a discipline, science is a discipline, mathematics. These are all different ways of understanding the world. And these disciplines all have rules and ways of making sense. And the value of studying those things, lens that I developed to interpret what's going on, what your student is asking, can be applied in different ways, because I can look at things from a very different kind of order of meaning. And I wonder, as you're talking about things change, some ways the disciplines are changing, and how do we help students make sense of that as they're just starting to learn? We're doing mental exercises in school. Like, what does it mean to be literate? What does it mean to be a historian? What does it mean to be a scientist? What does it mean to be a mathematician?
Well, to be honest, we would need many more webinars to really go into that. But let me caricature my own position. I used to believe that the major purpose of education should be to help individuals navigate the major disciplines that human beings have developed over the last centuries. I have decided that the disciplinary terrain and how we navigate it is going to be very different going forward than it has been when I was young. Large language machines are going to be doing most disciplined thinking much better than most of us can do. There are going to be always a few people who write great history or great music in ways that AI couldn't, but by and large, AI will do it better than most of us. So I make two moves here. Move number one is we should expose every kid to the whole range of disciplines, very much in the spirit of a children's museum, where you can be exposed to many, many different ways of learning, but that human beings themselves, using the 3 R's, decide which disciplines they want to pursue. And was walking through the American Museum of Natural History, Andrew, with your two children 6 months ago, which said to me, you could invent a whole university based on what's available in the American Museum of Natural History, which is infinitely more than I acquired when I walked through it in 1940 and 1950. But what we can't duplicate with museums or with AI are the kinds of lessons I learned from scouting. I was a Cub Scout, Boy Scout explorer, and from religious education. I happen to be educated as a Reformed Jew. I'm not a believer or an observer now, but the skills I learned both in scouting and religion are the kinds of things which I can't consign to it being voluntary. So to caricature what Howard Gardner said, if you want to do biology, or you want to do biochemistry, or you want to do ancient history, fine, it shouldn't be a requirement. But the kinds of human skills, and especially the skills of conversation, debate, discussion, dealing with difficult issues, being in a competition, but then joining forces, the kind of thing I learned as a scout, and the kind of thing I learned in my classes at Madison Avenue Temple 70 years ago, Stanton. And again, doesn't have to be formal religion. I'm more of a humanist now than I am a Jew or a Catholic or a Muslim or anything else. But I think much more of education is going to have to be learning how to develop relationships where we can discuss and debate difficult issues and come to agreement. So in a sense, democracy will not be acquired principally by reading the Declaration of Independence or the Magna Carta, but by learning to compete, but then cooperate with peers. And of course, scouting shouldn't be one gender and religion shouldn't be one religion, but that kind of human connection in the what I call the post-Anthropocene age, the age when human beings are no longer triumphant over every other part of living matter, or for that, atomic matter. If we want to survive as a world, as a species, well, we can't skip the kinds of things you get learning how to relate to peers in both a competitive and a collaborative way. And I would love everybody to be a master of history or biology or chemistry or class music, but I think that should be more of an option. And in fact, if you all think about it, the subject matters you learned in school that you didn't like, whether it was economics or chemistry, you've forgotten. The stuff that you didn't like, whether it was geometry or medieval music, those are the things which still motivate you and you still follow.
Indeed. I think the idea of providing a cornucopia of experiences so people understand where their talents or interests are, and then which talents they want to develop and which interests they want to pursue is an important component of schooling. There's this element of self-reflection, important potentially through an educational experience or as a component of an education. I need to be able to think about what's my relationship to this talent or this interest and how do I want to pursue it or not. I can go much deeper. I'm curious if Lucy may have noticed some questions that came up that I may have missed. Yes, Dad.
Yeah, Andrew, one thing, you and I both know that one of Gardner's intelligence is intrapersonal, understanding yourself. You've now been a teacher, an educational technologist, and somebody who works with both kids and professionals. What do you think about enhancing understanding of yourself? I mean, this is something which would never have occurred to my parents or grandparents. Understanding of yourself was totally an option and probably a sign of self-regard. But what do you think about education for each person about himself and herself as something? When should it begin? How should it be done? Is it just as well if it never happens, or are you a real casualty if it doesn't happen until a midlife crisis or an identity crisis?
I think one of the challenges we're facing right now in social media is a piece of this. I'm not an over-believer in Jonathan Haidt, but I do understand and believe in having been in education technology. There is a lot of focus on, we live in a culture of democracy and rugged individualism and capitalism. And the cult of individualism has led in some cases to over-identification with the self and the lack of community and or understanding of what it means to be a part of a community. And I think this is where schools are really fantastic because they are communities, and having taught young children, the job is basically to help them understand what's the needs of the individual, what's the needs of the group, and what's the needs of the larger group. That's what you do as a first grade teacher. And you have to reconcile and deal with the discomfort that not all three can be attended to at the same time. And the balance of that is important. And many educators have been recognizing that and doing that for a long, long time. And so self-reflection and self-awareness is a piece of it. I believe the culture has also leveraged that. And this is maybe why social emotional learning has some baggage now, which it didn't have a few years ago, is that there's an over-identification with individuality, safe spaces. Michael Roth, again, referring back to the Wesleyan president where I went to school, and got this concept of safe enough spaces, because we need to be able to manage some discomfort to be able to successfully navigate as a citizen and as a global citizen, self-manage. I think there's a huge role in helping individual student understand their desires and interests and how they can best make use of themselves in this world. But I also think over-indexing on that can create some forms of narcissism and some forms of overstating the importance of the individual over the needs of the community. And that's very American. We see maybe some less of that outside this country. And I think about, I was reading some AI articles the other day around the US investment in AI. We are just all in. Whereas we look at China, and there's been investments in AI, but there's also investments in modern electric systems, solar, wind, environmental conservation. They're spreading out, they're hedging their bets there. And here we are solely focused on this AI piece. And I just continue to think about that in relationship to the individual and the brain and the mind, and how people can leverage that and not thinking about the needs of beyond the individual, but as a group. That may be a bit of a divergent anecdote there, but I do think we do live in a cult of individuality, and we can over-index on it. And I think these don't help because everything is so customized. Question popped up on the screen, Lucy.
Basically, I love this conversation, and I love the conversation that's going on in the chat. We have people from Rwanda, Canada, and you name it, sharing their thoughts. So I just wanted to let you guys know that that was going on, and I'll send you a copy of some of the comments so you can see it afterwards. But my question is for you: how do we, let's say we come out of this really trying time and succeed in strengthening democracy? What do we need to do to repair that in society, and what do we need to do with youth specifically? How do we come out of this and evolve and learn from this time, in your view, Howard? I'd be really curious to hear what you have to say on that.
Okay, I will try to be succinct because it's a very hard question. I think that two things which are very different. One is, to the extent that you're an adult, particularly an elder, and you have some influence, you try to model what you think is the best way to handle things and to point out in a non-confrontational way things which you think are counterproductive. But also, and Andrew and I corresponded about this before, if democratic processes are really undermined, as they may well be, you have to try to keep them alive in your own mind and in the minds of people who are closest to you. I had friends who lived in Romania who had to go through an era which was as totalitarian and autocratic as anybody could imagine. And I said, what did you do during that period, the Ceausescu period, which I think ended about 1989? And they said, music and mathematics. Now, that may be an odd answer for most of us who don't live musically or mathematically, but what they were really saying is you needed to have a safe space in your own mind and people who you loved and dealt with, where you could make good music and make good mathematics without worrying that the Gestapo, whatever the Romanian equivalent was going to turn you in. And I hope that nobody, whether they're in Rwanda or anywhere listening to this, watching this, have to do anything like that. But if democratic processes really disappear, we have to try to keep them alive in our own mind and in the people who we're closest to. Jews and Chinese are very different from one another, but during eras where Judaism on the one hand and Confucianism on the other were completely being attacked by totalitarian forces, people would meet in the basement. This is before you had powerful electronics, and at least in their own families, they would try to transmit the values which were important to them. I pray this doesn't happen, but it's what keeps stuff alive in very, very hard times.
That's great advice, and I think that's really important. And unfortunately, here in the U.S., I feel like we didn't think this sort of thing would really happen. We thought there were hints of it, but we didn't really think that people were serious about it. And now we're seeing the evidence of that. And so I think this conversation will be really helpful to people who are afraid of losing hope. And no one can take that hope away from you. It's up to individuals. And one way of doing that is to pursue the things that bring you comfort, like playing music or studying math or diving into whatever subject area is your thing. So I really appreciate that answer. Are there any other questions from anyone before we wrap up? Because we're almost at the top of the hour and I want to make sure that we are respectful of people's, but we really appreciate your time and thoughtfulness put into this, Andrew and Howard. It's a special treat to hear from you and to see you guys talk and interact. Is there anything you want to leave us with, Andrew, and then Howard, before we wrap up?
One thing I was thinking about, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently, I think Chuck had made a point about it in the chat, is that if we think about the intelligences and we think about the imitation of human learning that's happening now with AI, I think one area that is going to be very hard to imitate is bodily kinesthetic and understanding our body and understanding our body's response to the experience of emotions, the experience of metabolizing emotions. And I think as we move forward to maintain democracy and continue to think about how, humans will be viable in this world, I think there's a lot of undiscovered stuff in how our bodies experience. And that can go back to kind of pre-science eras of and understanding the wisdom of the universe. And it seems strange and uncharacterized, but I think there's stuff there. That may be part of what it means to be educated going forward too. What is our physical experience and our lived experience in response to information or experiences?
It reminds me of trauma-informed practices and
Yeah.
and the ACEs study, which spoke to me about my childhood trauma and how that physically takes a toll on health going forward. So I think there's something to be tied to that too. I think that research is really interesting.
Yeah, and tons of the work that's going on with psilocybin and different ways of mind enhancement that was tinkered with and experimented with in the 60s, but now is being thought about more in clinical contexts and thinking about the expansiveness that minds are capable of and ways by which we can access that, because those are less replicable. I think we're in a very replicable era.
Yeah, my thought, based on this enjoyable and I hope helpful conversation, is everybody should think about the best educational and best humanistic experiences that they've been fortunate enough to have. I'm lucky because I've had a lot of them. Best not just to capture them, but how to share them with others, particularly with younger people. Because while we don't all get flow from exactly the same thing, it's necessary for everybody, and especially for people who are young, to feel that there are experiences of hope that can keep you going. And so don't keep those to yourself, share them. And it's not a D thing. You don't have to debate it, because all you're saying is, this was really wonderful for me. And if it's going to be helpful for you, I want to help you achieve it and have it. So preserving and extending things, especially of an educational sort, that were significant for you is very important. I like to quote Henry Adams, who said, a teacher affects eternity. He, and now he would say he or she, never knows when his influence ends. And that's the great thing about being in education, is you can preserve and extend some really positive experiences, and especially in times of threat, which is what's generated this conference. It's especially important not to forget those, but to highlight them and to share them.
That's perfect. Thank you again, Howard and Andrew, for your time. We look forward to continuing the conversations the next 2 days with everyone, and we'll see you at the next set of sessions. Have a good day.
Thank you, Lucy.
Bye-bye.
Bye then.